The moon hung low over Willow Creek, pale and tired, its light spilling thinly across the canyon walls. Dust swirled in the silver beams, mixing with the acrid bite of gunpowder that stung the back of the throat. Somewhere beyond the bend, hooves churned the hard earth, their echoes caught between rock and night. Martha Collins crouched behind a jut of limestone, breath slow, steady, the Colt in her hand warm from the last shot. Her heart didn't race, it thudded, heavy as a mallet against oak. She had learned, out here, that panic got you killed. The weight of the revolver felt strange and yet familiar, like a tool she had once feared and now understood in her bones. Across the narrow ravine, Samuel Hartwell's silhouette was cut against the moonlight, wide-brimmed hat low, rifle braced against his shoulder. Every movement was deliberate, no wasted motion. He had told her once, weeks ago, in a fight, you don't rush. You let the other man run headlong into his grave. A faint clink of metal on rock, someone shifting in the shadows above them. Martha's eyes found the glint, just for a heartbeat. Her mind flashed to the day she first saw Samuel, his shadow falling over her as she lay half-conscious on the dusty street of Cedar Ridge, the sun burning her eyelids. A deal struck with little more than a look. No love then, just survival. And yet here she was, risking her skin for his. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the faint sweetness of wildflowers crushed under boots. It also carried voices low, cruel laughter echoing off the stone, Jake Hartwell's voice among them. She could hear it even without the words. It was the sound of a man who had nothing to lose and everything to steal. Samuel's rifle barked once, the shot cracking through the canyon. One of Jake's men cried out, a raw, guttural sound. The reply came in a scatter of revolver fire, each shot throwing sparks off stone. Chips of limestone stung Martha's cheek. She ducked lower, tasting grit between her teeth. She thought of the child she carried, the quiet mornings in the ranch house when she would rest her hand on her belly, wondering if this land would keep them safe or swallow them whole like it had so many before. A shadow broke from the ridge above one of Jake's men sliding down the slope, revolver in hand. He was aiming for Samuel. Martha moved before thinking. Rising to one knee, she sighted along the Colt's barrel, the night narrowing to a single heartbeat. She squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked, and the man spun, collapsing into the dust. The gun slipped from his hand and clattered against the rock. Silence followed, not the kind that brought peace, but the kind that made every breath feel stolen. She felt Samuel's eyes on her from across the ravine. Just for an instant, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. From somewhere deeper in the canyon, Jake's voice rose, harsh and sharp. This ain't over, Sam. The sound faded into the night, swallowed by the wind and the distant call of a lone coyote. The fight was not won, not yet, but the gun smoke was thinning, the hoofbeats retreating into shadow. Samuel motioned for her to stay low as he moved toward the ridge, every step cautious. Martha's hand trembled now, but not from fear, more from the weight of what she had done and what she might yet have to do. The revolver hung in her grip, barrel cooling in the night air. She had crossed a line tonight, one she could never uncross. Above them, the stars blinked cold and indifferent, scattered across a sky that had seen more death than any man could count. The West had a way of swallowing stories whole, leaving nothing but bones and rumors. Martha let her gaze follow the line of the canyon, the moonlight tracing the curves of stone and shadow. Somewhere out there, Jake was still moving, still breathing, still scheming. She knew in her bones that he wasn't the kind of man to ride away for good. And in that moment, with the dust settling and the echo of her gunshots still in her ears, she understood something Samuel had once told her. Out here, the end of one fight is just the start of another. The dust never settled in Cedar Ridge. It hung in the air like a tired ghost, stirred by every wagon wheel and boot heel that passed down Main Street. The sun was a pale furnace above, pressing its weight into the weathered boards of the storefronts, into the cracked lips of men leaning against posts with eyes half hidden beneath hat brims. Martha Collins came into town on foot, though no one knew from where. Her dress was travel-worn, the hem torn and stiff with old mud. The bonnet shaded most of her face, but the eyes beneath were alert, wary eyes that had learned long ago to count exits before entering a room. She carried nothing but a leather satchel, its weight more hope than possessions. By the time she reached the saloon's corner, the last of her strength was gone. Her knees buckled, and she went down hard onto the packed red dirt. Around her, the town went on, voices at the livery, the clink of glasses behind the saloon's swinging doors, the faint laughter of card players. No one stopped. No one but him. Samuel Hartwell was crossing from the general store, a sack of coffee beans slung over one arm, when he saw her. He was a broad man, built like the oaks that grew stubborn in the creek beds. his face set in the lines of a man who'd known too much wind, too much loss. For a moment, he simply stood there, the shadow of his hat cutting across his eyes. Then he stepped forward, the boards of the walkway creaking under his boots. "You aim to die here, ma'am." His voice was low, rough, like gravel shifting under wagon wheels. Martha looked up, and for the first time their eyes met. There was no pleading in hers, only a tired defiance. She didn't answer. Samuel crouched beside her, setting the sack of coffee down in the dust. He offered his hand. "I've got a house 10 miles west, land enough for cattle, but I got no family left." He let the silence stretch, the wind whistling between buildings. "You look like a woman who needs a roof. I need a wife. We could solve both problems." It wasn't romance. It wasn't even kindness, not in the way folks meant it. It was a bargain spoken plain, the kind this country understood. Her lips parted, dry and cracked. "You don't even know my name." "I know enough," Samuel said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't a question. They married the next day, in the saloon's back room. A preacher was fetched from the far end of town, and 3 ranch hands served as witnesses. Martha stood in her weather-beaten dress, Samuel in his worn coat. When the vows were done, there was no kiss, just the solemn meeting of eyes, 2 people who'd both buried too much to pretend at softness. Elizabeth Thornton, the saloon's owner, watched from the doorway, her arms folded. Her gaze was sharp as a hawk's, the kind that weighed worth and weakness in the same glance. Martha felt it pierce through her, as if the woman could already see the whispers that would follow. That night they rode west under a bleeding sunset. The land stretched out before them in shades of rust and shadow, the air cooling as night gathered. Martha rode astride, her hands tight on the reins, the satchel pressed against her side. She didn't ask what waited for her at the Hartwell Ranch. She only knew it was better than the streets of Cedar Ridge, or so she told herself. The road was quiet except for the creak of leather and the occasional call of a night bird. Samuel didn't speak, and neither did she. But in that silence, Martha felt the first shift inside her, a space opening where fear and caution had always been. Yet as the lights of Cedar Ridge faded behind them, a thought rose unbidden, sharp as the desert thorns along the trail. Out here, nothing was truly given. Everything had to be kept, fought for, or stolen. And she wondered, as the moon climbed cold and distant above the prairie, which of those 3 her place beside Samuel Hartwell would turn out to be. The Hartwell Ranch rose from the plains like something carved out of stubbornness. A scatter of outbuildings, a long corral, and the main house, a 2-story frame of weather-bleached boards, stood against a backdrop of open range that reached to the horizon. There were no trees close by, only a few bent cottonwoods down by the creek, their branches twisted from years of wind. Martha stepped down from the saddle on that first morning, boots crunching against the frost-hardened dirt. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of hay, wood smoke, and the faint tang of manure. Samuel led the horses to the barn without a word, moving with the unhurried purpose of a man who'd repeated the same motions for decades. She followed him inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim. Dust motes floated in shafts of light slicing through gaps in the boards. A tabby cat blinked at her from atop a grain sack. Somewhere in the shadows, cattle shifted, their breath rising in small clouds. Samuel handed her a pair of worn gloves. "You'll need these. Wire'll eat your hands raw." That day, and many after, Martha learned the work of the ranch. She hauled feed, mended fence, and carried water from the well. The land didn't care she'd been a schoolteacher once. Out here, every hand earned its keep. By evening, her back ached, her palms burned, and a layer of dust clung to her skin. Yet there was a strange satisfaction in it, a weight that felt like something built, not just endured. When the work slowed, Samuel began teaching her to shoot. They stood in the open yard, the sun dipping low, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen stove. He placed the revolver in her hands, steadying her grip. "Don't pull the trigger," he said. "Squeeze it. Let the gun do the work." The first shot kicked harder than she expected, sending a shiver up her arm. The bullet struck the edge of the tin can they'd set on a fence post, spinning it into the dirt. Samuel gave the barest nod. Weeks passed. The days fell into a rhythm, the creak of the windmill in the dawn stillness, the lowing of cattle, the scrape of boots on porch boards. The sky seemed endless, a shifting dome of pale blue by day and star-scattered black by night. In those quiet hours, sitting by the fire with Samuel, Martha began to speak of her past, the blizzard that had taken her husband and child, the way the snow had swallowed all sound until it felt like the world had stopped. Samuel listened without interruption, the firelight catching in his eyes, and slowly, he told her his own ghost, Sarah, his first wife, shot dead in a botched horse theft, their boy, gone in the same night. It was in those exchanges, unadorned and plain-spoken, that something began to grow between them. Not the heady rush of courtship, but a quieter thing, trust born from the knowledge that both had stood in the cold shadow of loss. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west. The wind came first, rattling the shutters, carrying the smell of rain and distant lightning. Martha stood on the porch, watching the sky bruise and darken. Thunder cracked across the plains, and for a moment she thought of the blizzard again, how nature could turn without warning, stripping away everything you thought you could keep. Samuel stepped up beside her. Storm like this'll pass quick, but it can still break you if you don't see it coming. She didn't know if he was talking about the weather or something else entirely. The rain came hard and fast, drumming the roof, turning the yard to a patchwork of mud. They worked side by side to bring in the horses, the storm soaking them through, lightning showing their breath in quick white flashes. By the time the last stall door closed, both were dripping, silent, their hands raw from rope and rain. Later, as the wind eased and the lanterns flickered low, Martha lay in bed, listening to the settling of the house. Out here, the silence had weight. It pressed against her, filled her with an uneasy awareness of just how far they were from anyone who could help if trouble came. And in that stillness, she wondered if the storm outside had been only the first. The morning broke cold and colorless, a thin frost silvering the prairie grass. Martha woke before the sun, the quiet weight of the house pressing in around her. The windmill creaked outside, each slow turn groaning against the still air. She could hear the faint rustle of cattle in the far pasture, their breath steaming in the first light. She stepped out onto the porch, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The land stretched in all directions, a flat expanse of brittle grass and frost-darkened earth. To the east, the horizon was a faint smear of pale gold, but above it the sky held the heavy gray of a day that might never quite warm. Her hands found the porch rail, the wood worn smooth by years of weather and the grip of others who had stood here before her. She wondered if Sarah Samuel's first wife had once leaned in this same spot, looking out at the same cold morning. Did she feel the same weight in her chest? The land did not soften for anyone. Martha's eyes drifted toward the barn, its timbers dark with age, the roof sagging just enough to show time's slow bite. A lone hawk wheeled high above, its shadow sliding silently across the ground. Somewhere far off, the faint report of a rifle cracked the stillness, a rancher culling a coyote, perhaps, but the echo lingered in her mind longer than it should have. She moved through the morning's work without speaking. The pump handle groaned as she drew water, her breath turning to clouds in the air. Chickens scattered at her approach, their claws scratching at the hard earth. Each task was muscle memory now, hauling, mending, sweeping, but the silence between those motions seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. In the stillness, her thoughts turned to the storm that had swept over them days before. Not the rain itself, but the way it had come fast, swallowing the sky without warning. She could still feel the raw sting of the rope in her palms, the mud clinging to her skirts, the taste of lightning in the air. Nature had a way of showing you your own smallness out here. By midday, the frost had melted into a thin sheen of mud. Martha walked the fence line, the wire catching the winter sun like thin threads of ice. Her boots sank slightly with each step, the cold damp seeping in. The land was quiet, but it was not the peace of safety. It was the stillness before something breaks. She paused at the far gate, the view opening wide before her. From here she could see the trail that led toward Cedar Ridge, a faint scar in the grass. A vulture drifted lazily above it, riding the thermals. She thought of the town's noise, its wary eyes, the way whispers could turn into weapons sharper than any blade. Out here, distance was both a shield and a danger. A gust of wind lifted her hair, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else faint, metallic, like the memory of Gunsmoke. She felt a prickle along the back of her neck. She turned, scanning the horizon, but saw nothing except the endless roll of land and shadow. The afternoon light slanted low, painting the barn in copper and long shadow. She worked until her hands were stiff, then returned to the house, the floorboards groaning under her steps. Inside, the air was warmer, but it carried the same hush as the land outside. She lit a lamp, the flame fluttering against the glass, and for a moment watched the way the light trembled. Her thoughts circled back to Samuel. He was a man who carried his past like a holstered gun, always there, always ready, never spoken of unless necessary. She wondered how much of what he feared was behind them, and how much still rode somewhere on the horizon, drawing nearer with each turn of the earth. Night came slow but heavy, the kind that seemed to gather in layers. Outside, the stars burned cold and sharp, their light too far to warm anything. Martha sat by the window, her reflection pale in the glass, the darkness pressing just beyond it. Somewhere in that darkness, she felt certain, a shadow was moving toward them. The storm came crawling over the plains in the late afternoon, low clouds stacking black upon black. The wind was sharp with the scent of rain and something wilder like the tang of iron. By the time the first drops fell, the light had thinned to a dim, bruised glow, as if the sun had been smothered. Martha was in the barn, pitching hay, when she heard it, the hollow thud of hooves, not hurried but deliberate, each impact carrying weight. She stepped to the open door and saw them crest the rise, a knot of riders, dark against the rolling sky. 4 of them. At their head rode a man she did not know but somehow recognized in the set of his shoulders, the tilt of his hat. Jake Hartwell. The horses came down the slope at a walk, their coats slick with rain, steam rising off their backs. Jake sat easy in the saddle, a coil of rope hanging from his pommel, the brim of his hat shadowing a grin that was more teeth than warmth. The men behind him carried themselves like they were born in trouble, slouched, loose-handed, eyes that measured a place for what could be taken. Samuel stepped out from the house, his rifle resting across one forearm. The 2 brothers faced each other over 20 yards of wet earth, the rain now falling in hard, slanting sheets. No greeting passed between them, just the silent measuring of men who knew that whatever words came next would carry the weight of a drawn gun. Jake swung down from his horse with the slow, easy grace of a man who liked to be watched. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, the edges warped from damp. He held it up like a winning hand in a poker game. Even from the barn, Martha could see the seal and the spidery handwriting. Jake stepped closer, boots sinking into the mud. His voice carried easily over the rain. "Half this land's mine, Sam. Been mine since Pa left it to us. Got the proof right here." The wind caught the paper, snapping it in his hand like a flag. Samuel didn't move, but the set of his jaw was hard enough to cut stone. Martha felt her pulse hammering, the barn boards cold under her fingers. She knew enough of the West to recognize that what was being laid out in the rain was more than a family dispute. It was a claim of ownership that could turn violent before the clouds passed. Lightning flashed, spilling white light over Jake's face. He looked older than she expected, but not worn, just sharpened, like metal drawn too long over a whetstone. His eyes flicked toward her in the barn doorway, and in that single glance she felt the cold of something that wasn't just recognition, but calculation. Samuel spoke at last, his voice low. The rain muffled the words, but the tone was iron, a refusal. Jake's smile didn't falter, but the set of his shoulders changed. He tucked the paper back into his coat, as if he'd only just set a piece on a chessboard and knew the game would go on. The men mounted up without hurry. As they turned back toward the ridge, one of them spat into the mud, his gaze sliding to Martha and lingering a beat too long. When the sound of hooves faded into the storm's rumble, Samuel came into the barn. He didn't look at her right away, just checked the latches on the stalls, as though the act of keeping the horses in place might keep the rest of the world from spilling in. Martha watched the water drip from his hat brim, the way his fingers tightened on the last latch. The storm outside was passing, but she knew without asking that another had already begun, and it wouldn't be bound by weather. It began with the horses. 2 good mares gone from the north pasture, the wire fence cut clean, hoofprints leading off into the gullies. Samuel found the trail at first light, kneeling in the frost, his fingers brushing the fresh prints. No words passed between him and Martha, but they both knew whose hand had taken them. That night, the air carried a strange edge, dry, brittle, smelling faintly of smoke though no fire yet burned. The moon was a thin sliver, barely enough to paint the corral in silver. The windmill groaned slow, as if reluctant to turn. Martha stood at the porch rail, the rifle leaning against her shoulder. In the dark distance, coyotes sang to each other, their voices bending on the wind. She thought of Jake's eyes the day he'd ridden and how they'd measured her as part of the land he meant to claim. The thought sat in her chest like a stone. The fire came 2 nights later. It started in the hay barn, a sudden roar in the stillness, dry tinder catching like gunpowder. By the time Martha reached the yard, Samuel was already running for the pump, shouting for Fletcher and Cole, the hands sleeping in the bunkhouse. The night lit up in angry orange, shadows jerking across the ground. The heat hit like a wall, carrying the sharp stink of burning hay and pitch. They fought it with buckets, with wet blankets, with everything at hand. Martha's arms ached, her lungs clawed for air, eyes stinging from smoke. Above the crackle of fire came the frantic bellow of the horses in the main stable, the pounding of hooves against stall doors. By dawn, the barn was gone, reduced to blackened ribs against the pale sky. Half the winter feed was ash. The smell hung over the ranch, thick and clinging. Word reached them before noon Jake had been seen in town that night, buying drinks for half the saloon, laughing loud enough for the street to hear. And with the drinks came the whispers, that Martha had married Samuel for his land, that she'd brought bad luck to the Hartwell name, the kind of talk that stuck like burrs, spreading with every telling. Samuel's temper was a quiet thing, the kind that didn't flare but deepened, like coals banking heat. He said nothing to the hands, nothing to her, but he began riding the fence lines himself, long before sunrise and well past dark. Martha refused to stay inside. She took to walking the perimeter with the men at night, rifle in hand, boots crunching the frost. The land looked different under the moon, stripped to shape and shadow, every movement in the grass a possible threat. Sometimes, in the stillness between wind gusts, she thought she could hear hooves far off, pacing just beyond sight. Other times, she caught a flicker of movement on the ridge, a rider watching, waiting, but when she blinked, it was gone. The attack stopped for a week. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed on her in the mornings, when the frost clung to the porch rail, in the afternoons, when the wind hissed through dry grass, in the nights, when she lay awake listening for the soft tread of boots on the yard's hard earth. Every sound became a question, every shadow a shape that might step forward. On the 8th night, she woke to the sound of the windmill turning too fast, groaning under a sudden push of wind. She rose, crossed to the window. The yard was empty, but the gate hung open. Beyond it, the land rolled away into darkness, and she could almost feel eyes looking back at her from that black. She stood there until the glass fogged under her breath, the cold biting her bare feet. Somewhere in the distance, a lone horse whinnied, and the sound carried an edge that did not belong to the wild. The moon was high over Willow Creek. Its light stretched thin across the canyon, turning the dust into a pale, shifting haze. The air held the dry, metallic taste of stone and gun oil. Somewhere in the dark, a rock shifted under a boot, and the sound cracked the stillness like a match striking. Martha lay on her stomach behind a ridge of limestone, the Colt resting steady in her hands. Her heartbeat had slowed to a deliberate thud, one she could count, measure, hold. She could see Samuel crouched 20 yards away, his rifle cradled against his shoulder, eyes locked on the narrow pass where Jake's men would come through. The plan was simple, catch them as they drove the stolen cattle through the choke of the canyon. But plans were just paper out here, and paper tore easy. A night wind slid down the canyon walls, whispering over sagebrush. It carried the faint jingle of spurs, the deep, steady thump of hooves. Martha's fingers tightened on the revolver's grip. She thought of the past weeks, the empty stalls, the burned barn, the way Jake's eyes had lingered on her in the rain. She had no illusions left about what he meant to take, or what he'd destroy if he couldn't have it. The first rider emerged from shadow, his horse's flanks wet with sweat, steam curling in the moonlight. Behind him came two more, then a cluster driving the cattle low, restless shapes moving in a press of dust. Samuel's rifle spoke first. A sharp crack, a flash, the front rider pitching sideways into the dirt. The canyon exploded shouts, the frantic ball of cattle, the ringing chaos of hooves on stone. Martha rose to one knee, sighting along the Colt's barrel. The second man wheeled his horse, pistol lifting toward Samuel. She squeezed the trigger. The shot punched through the night, and the man reeled, his gun spinning away. She moved without thinking, shifting to another rock for cover. The air was alive with gunfire, now sparks leaping from stone, the smell of burned powder mixing with dust. Somewhere to her left, Fletcher was yelling, though the words were lost in the echo of the canyon walls. A shadow moved high on the ridge, a rider taking the long flank. Martha caught the glint of a rifle barrel, the line of his aim, straight at Samuel. Her stomach tightened. She fired, the recoil jolting up her arm. The man jerked back, disappearing from view. Then came a sound she hadn't expected, the unmistakable bark of Jake's voice, rising over the chaos. Fall back, pull him out. The order cut through the din, and the riders began to peel away, driving the cattle toward the open desert. Samuel pushed forward to the pass, firing until the last shadow slipped into the night. The canyon fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the slow settling of dust and the low groan of a wounded man somewhere among the rocks. Martha's breath came in shallow pulls, her arms trembling now that the shooting had stopped. She stepped out from cover, the Colt still warm in her hand. Her eyes found Samuel's across the pale-lit ground. In his look was the same thing she felt: relief, yes, but also the hard knowledge that this was not over. From the shadows near the pass, Fletcher dragged one of Jake's men into the open, the outlaw's leg bent wrong, his face pale with pain. Samuel looked down at him, then at Martha. No words passed, but the meaning was clear. This man could talk, and his talk could hang Jake. The wind picked up, brushing cold against Martha's cheek. Above them, the stars burned sharp and remote, watching without care. She holstered the Colt, but her hands didn't feel any lighter. The echo of the gunfire still clung to the rocks, to the back of her mind. She knew just as Samuel knew that Jake was still out there, and the next time he came, it wouldn't be for cattle. The saloon smelled of whiskey and wood smoke, the air thick with the weight of bodies pressed close. The tables had been pushed against the walls to make space, but the scent of old ale and spilled beer clung to the boards. A single lamp hung from the ceiling, its light swaying faintly, throwing long shadows that crept over faces and floor. The judge sat at the far end, a big man in a worn black coat, his eyes small but sharp. His desk was nothing more than a whiskey barrel with a plank laid across it. Behind him, the walls bore bullet scars, reminders that in Cedar Ridge, justice had always stood shoulder to shoulder with violence. Jake Hartwell lounged to one side, hat pushed back, a grin playing at his lips. He wore a clean shirt, but it couldn't hide the dust of the trail, nor the tension in the way his hands flexed at his sides. His men leaned in the shadows, their eyes flat and unreadable. Samuel stood opposite, hat in his hands, his posture straight but heavy with the weeks behind him. Beside him, Martha felt the eyes of the room pin her in place, cowboys, storekeepers, saloon girls, all watching. Some with curiosity, some with doubt, some with the quiet hunger for a story worth repeating. The judge's voice broke the murmurs. "Mrs. Hartwell, you have the floor." She stepped forward, the boards creaking under her boots. For a moment, the noise of the saloon shuffling feet, the faint clink of glass faded, and all she could hear was her own breath. Her mind flashed to the barn fire, the cut fence, the dead of night with the gate swinging open. She thought of Jake's gaze in the rain, the glint in his eyes at Willow Creek, and she remembered the man Fletcher had dragged from the rocks, broken, beaten, and willing to speak. Martha began plainly, her voice steady, the words deliberate. She told of the night Jake rode in with papers in hand, claiming half the ranch. She described the stolen mares, the blaze in the hay barn, the whispers in town meant to turn neighbor against neighbor. She spoke of Willow Creek, the gunfire, the stolen cattle, the wounded man who confessed Jake had sold his own claim years ago to pay off a gambling debt. Her words moved slow, each one landing like a bootstep in dry dirt. She did not look at Jake until the end, when the room had gone silent, but for the soft hiss of the lamp. His smile had thinned, his jaw working. The judge took the papers Martha handed him, yellowed, creased, smelling faintly of smoke from where she'd kept them in the kitchen stove's warming drawer. He read them without hurry. Then he leaned back, eyes narrowing at Jake. "You sold your half to a card table and a bottle, Mr. Hartwell," the judge said. "You've no more claim here than I do." A low murmur rippled through the room, like wind through dry grass. Jake's men shifted, their hands brushing the butts of their pistols, but no one drew. Samuel said nothing, but Martha felt the tension in him, the coil of readiness. She knew everyone knew that the judge's words might not end this. Out here, a verdict on paper didn't always carry past the saloon doors. Jake's grin returned, but it was a different thing now. Thinner, colder. He tipped his hat to the judge, to Samuel, even to her. "Reckon we'll see how long that paper keeps you warm," he said softly. The judge banged the gavel once, a sound dull against the wood, but his eyes never left Jake. Case dismissed. Hartwell's keep the land. The saloon began to empty, boots thumping on the porch outside. The light shifted as the door swung and closed, until only a few remained. Martha stood still, the taste of dust in her mouth. Through the open doorway, she could see the street sunlight spilling low and red over the roofs, painting long shadows across the dirt. Somewhere down that street, Jake was walking away, and she knew, by the set of his shoulders, that he wasn't done walking back. The days after the trial came cool and bright, the sky a hard, unbroken blue that seemed to stretch forever. The air carried the sharp bite of autumn, and the cottonwoods down by the creek had turned to gold. On the surface, Cedar Ridge went on as before. Wagons creaked along Main Street. The blacksmith's hammer rang in steady rhythm, and the saloon doors swung with the ebb and flow of men seeking whiskey and news. But for Samuel and Martha, the quiet was not peace. Jake was gone. No one could say where. Some swore they'd seen him riding south toward the border. Others claimed he'd been spotted in the mining camps up in the hills. In the west, men could vanish as easy as smoke on the wind. and they could come back just as sudden. At the ranch, work filled the daylight. The rebuilt barn rose plank by plank, the scent of fresh-cut pine mixing with the ever-present tang of manure and dust. Samuel worked alongside the hands, his shirt damp with sweat despite the cool air, his eyes always flicking to the horizon when a rider passed on the distant trail. Martha took to her chores with the same quiet determination. She tended the chickens, mended the worn shirts, kept the rifles cleaned and oiled. In the evenings, she sat on the porch, a blanket around her shoulders, watching the light drain from the land. Sometimes she rested her hand on the gentle swell of her belly, feeling the life within her turn and shift. She thought often of the trial, not the judge's verdict, but Jake's parting words. They had clung to her, heavier than the dust in her hair after a long day's ride. "Reckon we'll see how long that paper keeps you warm." Words like that weren't thrown into the wind. They were planted, meant to grow in the mind until the roots reached deep. One evening, just before sunset, Samuel joined her on the porch. He lowered himself into the chair beside hers, the wood creaking under his weight. They sat in silence, the air cooling around them, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. Beyond the fence, the pasture rolled out toward the distant hills, the grass rippling under the touch of the wind. A small band of antelope grazed near the creek, their movements quick and delicate. The world looked still enough to believe in safety, but both of them knew better. Martha's thoughts wandered to the winter ahead, the storms that would come down from the mountains, the nights when the wind would scrape against the shutters like a warning. She wondered if Jake would choose such a night to return, when the dark was deep and the air too cold for men to ride far without reason. The sun slid low, staining the land in rust and shadow. Samuel reached for her hand. His was rough and warm, scarred from years of work and fight. She held it, and for a moment, the weight of the past months seemed to lift. But as the first star blinked into the darkening sky, a lone rider appeared far out on the trail, just a dark shape against the fading light, moving slow, too far to tell if it was friend or stranger. The figure paused at the ridge, sat there for a long heartbeat, then turned and disappeared over the far side. Neither of them spoke. The wind had stilled, but it carried a feeling like the moment before a door is pushed open. Martha leaned back in her chair, eyes still on the ridge, and thought about how in the West, endings were just pauses in the story.